We're living in a pandemic of labelling. Well, how can it be that we're living in this pandemic of labelling? Imagine, if you will, you went to a restaurant, and in said restaurant you asked for food. Not a specific menu item, but you just asked for food. What's the likelihood that you would actually receive the food you wanted? In addition, imagine you're a mechanic. You can't just look at a car and say, that car's broken. Instead, a mechanic, what they do is they run tests, right? And in those tests, they're trying to find the specific problem in order to find a specific solution to fix the car. So, you get what I'm saying, but how can we be living in a pandemic of labelling? Is it not the case that anyone you know who could be suffering often tends to go to the doctors these days? And in that moment when they go to the doctors, it's often the case that they come out with a condition. It's often seen that a lot of people this day and age actually have conditions. And the doctor only has time to identify their current suffering and prescribe what they feel is the correct solution to said suffering. But imagine, if you will, you had a bad day. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's something you can look back and say, this was the worst day ever. Everything fell apart. Everything went wrong. I know, I've been there a few times. And in that day, as I say, everything falls apart. And yet, on a different day, the exact same circumstances try and find the way in, the exact same problems reoccur, and yet you handle it with a complete different certainty, a complete different strategy. And the way you communicate with yourself is completely different at the end of the day. You don't just finish the work shift or the day and think that was the worst day ever. You think, oh, that's fine, we can prioritise that for another day, we can handle it, it's not a big issue. What's happened here? It's not just that your skill set's improved, of which they may have, it's also the communication you use with yourself. The language we use will trigger an emotional response in ourselves in order to justify not just how we're feeling, but how we're acting. Now imagine, if you will, before written language, how was it that we learned everything we learned? It was through storytelling. Whether it be a chief at a fire, whether it be a great leader, whether it be, as I say, a relative, a friend. You would learn how to act in the world through language alone. For example, let's say we had a certain kind of berry, and you sat around a fire and the chief says, this berry, if you eat this, it means death, instant death. If you eat this second berry, it looks like this, it tastes like this. If you eat this second berry, you will get sick. And if you eat this third berry, you might hallucinate or see things. Now, you can say, oh yeah, I see what you're getting at. But if you actually think about it, what's happening here is each different berry, you are triggering an emotional connection to that language pattern, to that association of said fruit, berry, or whatever it may be. Death. That triggers an intense emotional reaction, an emotional association. Now, I hear what you're saying. You might say, well, I'm not sat around a fire, I don't have these influences and these things don't happen to me anymore. Where is it that these associations can come from? Is it not true that the news uses very intense negative language? If you watch the news, not to vicariously understand what's going on in the world, but instead as a project just to listen to the adjectives they use, is it not true that they tend to rely on very negatively charged associations or negatively charged language patterns? For example, a crisis, an economic crisis. What about a market crash? These kinds of words, though they use them to try and explain circumstances and situations, also trigger an emotional, intense reaction inside you, without you even realizing it's happening. So, let's look at someone who is suffering, who has gone into the doctors, who is looking to find their specific problem and their specific solution. Let's also look at those people and ask ourselves, how do these people who are suffering communicate with themselves on a day-to-day basis. If you ask them, why are you suffering? Oftentimes you hear stories such as, I'm scared, I'm useless, I'm a burden, there's no point in me being here, nobody cares about me, I'm pathetic. These are all very negatively charged words, I'm sure you'd agree, or associations. Now, ask yourself, if they were to describe themselves, a positive moment in their life perhaps, or a positive situation. Hey, do you remember when this happened? Yeah, that was okay. Oh, and things can get better and this could happen for you. Yeah, I suppose so. Do you not see the difference in leverage they're putting onto these phrases and words that they are using to communicate with themselves? The positive influence that they put upon themselves, taking it from what could potentially be outstanding, amazing, lowering that down to, I suppose so. And when it comes to the negative side, instead of saying, you know, I'm a little frustrated, they say I'm a complete burden and I'm a failure. Now, this is not the only solution, but it is very important. So, patterns. Where is it that we learn these language patterns over time? How do we communicate with ourselves? As I say, it could have been around the chief around the fire. That's where we governed our old associations. But I also stated that we could have learned them and picked them up from news, from dramas, from people we surround ourselves with. Maybe even you have used a powerful, positive exclamation at one point and someone has turned around to you and said, why are you talking like that? Be realistic. And because of that negative charge you got as soon as that person said this thing, you completely remove this from your vocabulary entirely. A good question to ask yourself is, what adjectives do you use to describe yourself? And when was the last time you used a positive, a super emotionally charged positive phrase or statement to describe yourself? Remember, we are the chief to our own fire, and the story we tell ourselves triggers an emotional response internally that will affect our actions and our belief systems on the world. Now imagine, if you will, that you was a king, someone in charge, or maybe a CEO, someone that you feel is powerful, someone you see as in control. Even look at, just by saying this statement, I've changed how I stand, changed how I breathe, changed how I present myself. In this moment, when you are a king, maybe a CEO, you're in control, you're powerful, you will not be put down, you're ecstatic, you're on top of the world, these kind of phrases. What happened here? The only difference is the language you are using to communicate with yourself. So how is it that we're in a pandemic of labeling? Well, for example, what if every time you felt shy, a little overwhelmed, a little pressure or stressed, uncertain, unaware of how to change things, or even just a bit let down, you compiled all of these very small negative emotions and you put all of them into one condition, a condition that you have an intense negative emotional connection to. If every time I felt a bit overwhelmed, I said that I'm deeply aggravated, frustrated and distraught, even though it could have just been a small emotional response, it has now turned into something, an added weight into how I feel emotionally. In addition to conditions, the problem here is that you do have emotions and your emotions are trying to educate you. They're trying to tell you something. However, when you label all of your emotions and do not communicate with yourself, do not find the specific problem and the specific solution, what you do in turn is you remove all of the personal power and responsibility. You basically say to yourself that my emotions are not true, they're not real, they're just a part of a condition that I have. They're not valid. And how confident and in control do you feel if you actually believed that your feelings and emotions weren't valid, that they're not a part of your control or a part of something that you have to generate for, but instead are some kind of burden that has been placed upon you due to a condition that's outside of your control. How different might that make you feel? So I ask you, what language patterns do you use to describe yourself? What story every single day do you use to talk to yourself, to tell yourself? And what if you sculpted your own emotional patterns and changed the language you use to communicate with yourself? How might that change what you look for? And what if you use this language to finally break down the almost running tests on yourself, like the mechanic, to find the specific problem in order to find the correct solution? If we don't do this, if we don't communicate with ourselves effectively, what will happen is we will be trapped in this pandemic of labeling. Thank you.